Location: a desolate road outside Los Angeles, where fate brings together two worlds destined to collide. Sometimes, the people we look down on are the very ones who save us when we need it most. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? 13-year-old Darius Reed was not looking for trouble. He just wanted to get home. It was late, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted road. His hoodie was pulled tight over his head, hands stuffed into his pockets. The rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his sneakers was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Then he saw it. A stalled SUV sat on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing in the fading light. At first, he thought nothing of it. Cars broke down all the time. But then he heard the crying. 3 children, huddled together outside the vehicle, their faces streaked with tears. The youngest, no older than 5, clutched her older sister's hand, her small body trembling. Darius's steps slowed. Something was wrong. His eyes darted toward the driver's seat. The door was slightly ajar, but no one was moving inside. Then the little girl turned to him, her wide eyes filled with panic. Her voice came out in a shriek, cutting through the night air like a blade. "Help! Mommy isn't moving!" Darius froze for a split second, his heart hammering in his chest. He had not expected this. His instincts screamed at him to run, to pretend he had not seen anything, to avoid whatever trouble was unfolding before him. But something kept him rooted to the ground. He swallowed hard and took a step forward. The older of the 3 kids, a boy who looked around 10, wiped his face with his sleeve. His voice was shaky. "She won't wake up. We tried shaking her. We called her name." Darius's breath caught in his throat as he inched closer to the car. The woman in the driver's seat was slumped forward, her head resting against the steering wheel. He could not tell if she was breathing. He turned back to the kids, their frightened faces watching him, pleading without words. The little girl clung to her older sister's arm, sniffling loudly. The boy clenched his fists, his lower lip trembling. Darius's fingers twitched. He knew he could not walk away. Whatever was happening, these kids needed help. "Did you call anyone?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled. The boy shook his head. "I don't have a phone. She was talking weird before she stopped moving. Then she just—" His voice cracked, and he looked away. Darius sprinted toward the SUV, his heart pounding. Inside, a woman was unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel. The dim glow of the hazard lights flickered against her pale face, her body unmoving. "Mommy won't wake up," the oldest girl sobbed, gripping the side of the car. "We were driving, and then she just stopped moving." Darius quickly assessed the situation. The woman's breathing was shallow, barely noticeable. He hesitated for only a second before stepping closer, his mind racing through everything he had ever heard about emergencies like this. "Did she say anything before passing out?" he asked. The boy, about 8, nodded, his face streaked with tears. "She said her chest hurt." Darius's stomach twisted. He knew enough to recognize that was not a good sign. He had to act fast. He glanced at the children again. Their eyes, wide with fear, darted between him and their mother. The youngest girl clutched her sister's hand tightly, sniffling between quiet sobs. The boy, trying to be strong, balled his fists at his sides, his small frame trembling. Darius reached for the car door, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled it open. The interior light flickered on, casting a dim glow over the woman's still form. The soft hum of the engine was gone, the silence inside the vehicle thick and heavy. He leaned in closer. "Ma'am? Can you hear me?" No response. His mind raced. He knew he had to act quickly. He turned back to the kids. "We need to get help." The oldest girl's lip trembled. "But she's not waking up. What if she never wakes up?" "She will," Darius said firmly, "but we have to call someone right now." Darius grabbed the woman's phone from the front seat, his fingers shaking as he unlocked the screen. His heart pounded as he quickly dialed 911. The ringing seemed to stretch forever, every second feeling heavier than the last. 911. "What's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. Darius forced himself to speak clearly. "A lady passed out in her car. There are kids with her. She's barely breathing." "Where are you located?" the dispatcher asked. Darius looked around frantically. The road was dark, stretching endlessly in both directions. "I don't know exactly. We're near the freeway. There's a big gas station close by." The dispatcher's voice remained steady. "Help is on the way. Can you check if she's breathing?" Darius leaned in, watching the faint rise and fall of the woman's chest. "Yeah, but it's slow. She won't wake up." "Okay. Keep her head up and stay with the kids. Let them know help is coming." Darius turned to the children, their faces pale with fear. He took a deep breath and forced a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay. Help is coming." The youngest girl sniffled, gripping her older sister's arm. The boy wiped his face with his sleeve, his small hands still trembling. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last. Darius could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the woman, on the kids, on the darkness of the road that seemed to swallow everything around them. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone again. "Are the children safe? Are they hurt?" Darius looked at them carefully. They were scared, but physically they seemed okay. "They're not hurt," he said, "just really scared." "You're doing great. Stay calm. Help is close. Keep talking to them." Darius nodded, swallowing the fear rising in his chest. He turned to the kids, his voice softer now. "You guys are doing really good. Just hang in there. The ambulance is coming." The older girl bit her lip, nodding quickly. The boy fidgeted, kicking at the gravel beneath his feet. The youngest girl clung to her sister, her tiny body shaking from the cold, or maybe from fear. Darius wished he could do more. He wished he knew exactly what to say. "She's going to be okay, right?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Darius hesitated for only a moment. "Yeah, they'll help her. They know what to do." The wind howled down the road, rustling the trees nearby. The world felt too quiet, too still. Darius clenched his fists, willing the flashing lights to appear on the horizon. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was wait. Have you ever had to call 911? What was your experience? Let's discuss. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed as paramedics arrived. The wail of sirens filled the air, cutting through the eerie silence of the desolate road. Darius stepped back, his breath still uneven, watching as the professionals rushed in. He had done his part. Now it was up to them. The kids clung to him, their small hands gripping his jacket as if letting go would make everything worse. He could feel them shaking, their fear still raw. One of the paramedics checked the woman's pulse, while another prepared a stretcher. The scene was controlled chaos, voices overlapping as instructions were given. Darius's heart was still racing. He had never been this close to an emergency before. The flashing lights, the urgency in the paramedics' movements, it all felt surreal. He wanted to step away, but the children held on to him, grounding him in the moment. Their trust in him, a complete stranger, weighed heavily on his chest. Then a new sound shattered the moment. A black luxury car screeched to a stop just yards away. The driver's side door flew open and a man stormed out. His expensive suit wrinkled, his face a mask of panic and rage. Richard Montgomery. Darius barely had time to react before the man's sharp gaze locked onto him. His voice was harsh, demanding, "Who are you? What are you doing with my children?" Darius took a step back, stunned. He opened his mouth to explain, but Richard was already moving toward them. The oldest girl tightened her grip on Darius's arm. Her father grabbed her, his fingers wrapping tightly around her wrist. "Did he hurt you? Did he touch you?" The girl shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, no. He saved us. He helped Mommy." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Richard's breathing was uneven, his shoulders rising and falling rapidly. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from fear or fury Darius couldn't tell. The paramedics continued working behind them, their voices a steady hum against the tension crackling between them. Darius swallowed hard, his own pulse thudding in his ears. He had expected relief when help arrived, not this, not accusations, not hostility. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his throat felt tight. The girl's voice was desperate now. "Daddy, please!" He stayed with us. He made sure we were safe. Richard's grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but the suspicion in his eyes didn't fade. His gaze flickered between Darius and the children, and for the first time, hesitation crossed his features. The youngest girl sniffled and wiped her face with her sleeve. "He called the ambulance," she whispered. "He didn't leave us." The weight of their words seemed to press down on Richard. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. He turned to the paramedics, as if searching for confirmation, but they were focused on stabilizing his wife. Darius shifted his feet, resisting the urge to turn and walk away. He had done everything he could. Whether Richard believed it or not, he knew the truth. Do you think Richard will listen to the truth, or is he too blinded by prejudice? Let's talk. The paramedics confirmed the woman had suffered a mild heart attack and would recover. Their calm, professional voices filled the tense silence, reassuring the children that their mother was going to be okay. Richard, still fuming, turned to the officers. His expression remained tight with frustration. "I want to know what he was doing here." Officer Perez, shaking his head, stepped forward. His voice was firm but composed. "Sir, this young man saved your wife's life." Silence. Richard's expression faltered. His gaze flickered between the officer and Darius, who still stood frozen in place. The accusation in his eyes wavered, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, hesitation. The kids all spoke at once, their voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to make their father understand. They told him how Darius had called 911, how he had kept them calm, how he had stayed by their side when they were scared and alone. Richard's mouth opened slightly, as if forming words he could not quite bring himself to say. He looked at his children, at their tear-streaked faces, at the way they clung to Darius like he was their lifeline. He swallowed hard. I didn't realize." The weight of his own words seemed to settle over him. His shoulders, once tense with anger, slumped slightly. The fire in his eyes dimmed, and something else took its place. Regret. It was a look Darius recognized, one he had seen before in the eyes of those who had made assumptions about him. The paramedics continued their work, loading the stretcher into the ambulance. The woman's breathing had stabilized, her face no longer as pale as before. One of the paramedics turned toward Richard. "Sir, we'll be transporting her to County General. You can follow behind us." Richard nodded absently, his focus still on Darius. He took a step closer, his lips parting as if to say something, but the words remained unspoken. His hands curled into fists at his sides, then slowly relaxed. He exhaled heavily. The children, still clutching Darius, looked at their father with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The oldest girl sniffled. "Daddy, please don't be mad. He helped us." Richard rubbed a hand over his face. The fight within him was visible, the battle between pride and the undeniable truth. He inhaled deeply before glancing back at Officer Perez. I should thank him, shouldn't I?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now. The officer nodded. It would be the right thing to do. Richard turned back to Darius, his throat tightening. He had spent his life believing he could always read a situation, always know who to trust. But tonight, he had been wrong. The silence between them stretched. Darius held his ground, his face unreadable, his hands still clenched at his sides. He had nothing to prove, no reason to explain himself any further. Richard swallowed hard. "I was wrong about you." The words were stiff, hesitant, but they were there. The truth was settling in. Is an apology enough when someone's been wrongfully accused? Let's discuss. Richard Montgomery, a man who once dismissed people like Darius, now stood humbled. The next day, a sleek black car pulled up outside Darius's small apartment. The sound of an expensive engine idling in the quiet neighborhood drew curious glances from neighbors. Darius, stepping out onto the porch, squinted as the driver's door opened. Richard stepped out, envelope in hand. His tailored suit and polished shoes looked out of place against the cracked sidewalk. He walked up to Darius, his movements slower, more deliberate than the night before. There was no anger in his expression now, only something unreadable. "I owe you a debt I can't repay," Richard said, his voice quieter than Darius had ever heard it. Darius's eyes flicked to the envelope. He hesitated before taking it, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hands. He slowly lifted the flap, pulling out the neatly folded papers inside. A full scholarship to a prestigious academy. Financial support for his family. More than Darius had ever dared to hope for. His chest tightened. He looked up at Richard, unsure of what to say. "I didn't help for a reward." Richard nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. That's why you deserve it." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Darius's fingers brushed over the paper, the realization settling in. His family wouldn't have to struggle anymore. His future, once uncertain, now had a path paved before him. And yet, something inside him wrestled with the idea of taking it. He thought of the night before, the fear in the children's eyes, the helplessness of their mother, the weight of the responsibility he had taken on without hesitation. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't done it for anything other than the fact that it was the right thing to do. Richard watched him closely, as if searching for something in his expression. "This isn't charity," he said after a moment. "It's an opportunity. One I should have seen you deserved long before now." Darius swallowed, his throat tight. He had spent his life being overlooked, dismissed, judged, before he even had a chance to prove himself. Now, here he was, being given something that could change everything. He exhaled slowly, nodding as he folded the papers carefully and tucked them back into the envelope. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Richard gave a small nod, stepping back. "You earned it. Would you accept a reward, or is doing the right thing enough? Let's discuss." Darius's bravery forced a powerful man to confront his own biases. His kindness saved a family and changed their views forever. The weight of that night still lingered in his mind. Not just the fear, the uncertainty, or the accusations, but the way everything had shifted. He had never expected to be seen, much less acknowledged, by someone like Richard Montgomery. And yet, the truth had broken through, shattering the assumptions that had once defined him in the eyes of a stranger. Darius had always known who he was, but now others saw it too. As he held the envelope in his hands, the reality of his future felt different, no longer shaped by how the world perceived him, but by what he chose to do. A single moment of doing what was right had led to opportunities he had never imagined. But beyond that, it had proved something greater. That one act of kindness could break barriers and rewrite the future. He had not just changed one family's life, he had changed his own. The emotions from the past 24 hours still clung to him. He could feel the tension that had tightened his chest, the frustration that had burned through him when he was questioned, the quiet sense of triumph when the children had defended him. He had lived through every moment, yet it still didn't feel entirely real. He wondered how long it would take before he could process it all. His fingers brushed over the edge of the envelope, feeling the weight of it, not just in his hands, but in what it meant. It was a path forward, one he hadn't expected, but one he couldn't ignore. It was more than a reward. It was an acknowledgement, a correction of a wrong that had been made long before he had ever stood on that dark road. Richard Montgomery had given him this opportunity, but Darius knew he had earned it. He had earned it through courage, through resilience, through the simple act of choosing to help when he could have walked away. And even now, as he stood on the edge of something new, he reminded himself that he hadn't done any of this for recognition. He had done it because it was right. As he exhaled, he allowed himself to accept that change had come, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The assumptions had been shattered, the truth had prevailed, and for the first time in a long time, Darius saw a future that belonged to him. With new opportunities ahead, Darius knew his worth wasn't defined by how others saw him. It never had been. What's the biggest lesson from Darius's journey? Let's talk in the comments